About what time of year would people optimally, if you had a choice, when would you hunt sheep?
The sheep move up this hill as soon as the snow clears. We found that in years when it didn't snow much, like 1988 for instance, there was no snow at all up here through the winter. If there was, it was less than an inch worth. The sheep were up here most of the time. But on normal years, especially going back when there was more moisture in the climate, they would have come up here on a schedule that starts in April. That's about the time they could have gotten through the snow and fed on the vegetation that would green up about late April or early May, start to green up. I think people feeding on sheep would have followed the sheep up here right at that time, April or May. In some years it would have been as late as 1st of June. By the 1st of June the sheep are having their lambs. They're on a pretty restricted schedule here. If you go further south, sheep have lambs all year long, wild sheep. Here they have almost all of their lambs, and probably over 90% of their lambs are born in the same week. So they're on a fairly tight schedule because of the short growing season in the summer. And they have their lambs in very specific places. So I think the native people hunting sheep would have come up. The easiest time to get a lamb is right after it's born. That's when most of the predation actually happens here now without the hunters, without native hunters. Eagles take most of the lambs that are taken by predators, and it's within a day or two of them being born when they're about the size of a large marmot. And an eagle can dive down when a mother is not looking and just grab it and drop it off a cliff, or keep it in its talons and fly off with it. So that's the primary predation source now. When sheep eaters were here, I suspect sheep eaters were the primary predation source. And no telling what the herd sizes were like, but I suspect, just from more recent information, that the herds, individual bands of sheep, were smaller than they were in the 1970s, but spread out over almost this entire landscape, from the desert all the way through the foothills, in the montane zones that are open, like the Gros Ventre Formation, which stays open and doesn't support tree growth, and all the way up into the alpine, wherever there weren't trees. Bighorn sheep don't like to be in trees, they avoid them. But they can live up to 14,000 feet and all the way down into the low deserts like the Red Desert at 6,000 feet. When the Hayden expedition came through the Red Desert, they said that they ate bighorn sheep because it was the most common animal down there. So elevation doesn't really have much to do with distribution. Settlement had a lot to do with distribution. Where we find farming and agriculture, the sheep disappeared immediately, probably from domestic sheep diseases that bighorn sheep have absolutely no resistance to. So, although the sheep were spread out more, I think their individual groups had a low reproduction rate prior to ranching. I'm just throwing this out as an idea, but there's some evidence to support the fact that predation would have been lower and reproduction higher after ranchers brought in cows into the mountains, because they were putting mineral blocks up in the high country for their cows, which the cows required or they wouldn't survive up high. And those mineral blocks were used by bighorn sheep. The expansion of populations, especially the populations from the 1930s into the 1960s, was astronomical. They went from approximately 40 sheep here in the 1920s to 1,600 sheep conservatively by the 1960s. That's a huge population expansion, and it corresponds to the introduction of mineral blocks for cattle grazing in the high country. So I don't think the land was saturated with sheep in the sheep eater times. I think there were sheep everywhere, wherever the ground was open and uncanopied. In other words, no tree cover, which includes most of the alpine terrain in the Wind Rivers, with small groups of sheep, no large populations, but very dispersed small populations. So a place like this on a migration route with small numbers of sheep moving through constantly would have been an ideal place to hunt.